Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar this morning on the issue of local government assets, their sales, and how it might affect things like social infrastructure in place. My name is Joe Fyans. I'm the head of research at Localis, and I'm joined today by Sarah Snelson from Frontier Economics and David Marlow from, amongst other things, Third Life Economics and Kurds at the Newcastle University to talk about whether we are valuing properly local government estates and their sort of role in communities and in public life. And I think so. Before I get into our speakers, I'll just set the scene a little bit on the issue. So I think the impetus for this webinar. I think most people on the call will have seen the BBC report that came out at the end of August, which was all about councils in loads of debt selling loads of assets. And I think the headline was, community centres, care homes and libraries sold. And it was all very evocative. And I think, there was a lot of local response to that with different kind of local organs running their own version for their councils. And here's the stuff your council sold and how much debt they're in. And I think, we definitely don't want to get into the business of sort of making value judgments on this. And we have to acknowledge, kind of in fairness to councils, firstly, that there is such a thing as good debt or public acceptable debt in economic terms when we're doing public management, and likewise there's such a thing as assets that have sort of reached the end of their life cycle need to be divested of. We're absolutely not kind of making the case that councils should not ever be in debt and should never sell assets. And also, to be fair to councils, it's worth acknowledging the great pressure that they're under throughout the kind of last decade to be commercial and to make investments, and indeed that much of the pressure to borrow and now the pressure to sell has come from central government. However, it would be naive not to acknowledge that there are sort of valuable assets, socially valuable assets disappearing under things like capitalisation directions, best value notices, estate rationalisations, etc. from councils, and that isn't having an effect. And I think what we're trying to focus on today is those assets that we see most often in the press, those sort of controversial assets where it's, council gets rid of a sports club or a community centre or something like that. And is there a way that we can better value those assets when we look at the entirety of a council estate? And I think the impact of not doing that is firstly one of kind of perceptions, and I don't think it helps with the popularity of local government or with people's faith in local government as an agent of change if they feel like that they're always having to respond to crowd funders for their local sports club or whatever. I don't think that helps with that. But also, more importantly, there is this thing of social infrastructure, the things that kind of drive the ties that bind us. And I think when we divest ourselves too much of these things, when we rely too much on kind of community groups to manage them, by things like, the helpful but not, it's not a panacea, the community right to buy, we may end up in a position where kind of local government is not doing everything it can do to uphold social cohesion and to uphold kind of the fabric of life in place. And I think that's the kind of distinction we're trying to make here between sort of normal assets and social infrastructure. And to discuss this, when we're valuing things, good to ask some economists. So I brought David Marlow and Sarah Snelson in to kind of talk about these theories of value. And I'm just going to get David's slides up now. So that we can go through them. But David, if I invite you on now to introduce yourself for the audience here.
Yeah, good morning, and many thanks to Localis for having me on. Are the slides up? Because I can't see them.
Just get them up now, David. Bear with me. Just clicking the presenting Teams button.
Okay, that'd be great.
Sorry,
I didn't prepare a joke in anticipation of a technical glitch, but
there we go.
Great. Okay, so look, as Joe said, I'm a career development economist, sort of 25 years in senior public service, the last 8 as chief executive of a local authority, then of a regional development agency. Since 2008, I've been a consultant researcher with Third Life Economics, more recently a visiting professor of practice at the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle Uni, and I also co-host the Local Economic Development Confidential, LED Confidential podcast, which sort of deals with LED and placemaking more generally. So you'll have gathered from that I'm absolutely not an expert in either estate management or in property valuation, but I will try and just give a perspective and start, Joe, with the next slide, which is really a reflection on three post 2010 and very interrelated stories of council asset sales that in some senses are captured in the famous Oscar Wilde quote of knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. And that figure that you'll recognize in the bottom right of the screen is the Eric Pickles story, who actually did say, whilst he was sort of cutting revenue support grants and other funding, that this is not austerity for local government because you've got lots of reserved and underused assets you can sell. So that was a sort of a 2010 story, which actually then morphed into some work that my colleague at Kurds led on, Andy Pike, and the under the sort of really attractive or really enjoyable councillors at the casino motif. And that's the story of, because government grants are being cut so much, some councils, to be fair, a relatively limited number of councils, bought big in terms of commercial properties to generate revenue, to compensate for reduced government funding, and then got into trouble financially. And probably the most notorious example of that is Woking, which I have written about elsewhere. But even some of the great big cities like Birmingham and Nottingham got into similar types of trouble. And that leads us to the third story, which is of Michael Gove and the extraordinary financial support story as councils either issued Section 114 notices or asked for or received capitalisation directives and other support, all of which is posited from the government side on asset sales being in play to reduce the cost to government of the financial breakdown. So next slide, please. And behind these stories is an asset base that is actually really difficult to value precisely for a whole range of professional valuation reasons, which I'm not able really to comment on. But there are different classes of asset that the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government valued something over £700 billion in their latest 2024 figures. But of that amount, far and away the two biggest classes of assets, so the two big lines in the graph on the left, are operational services and housing revenue account related, maybe accounting for getting on for 500 billion of the 700 billion. And of the smaller lines that you can see on the graph, the second smallest, which is investment properties, is around 25 billion. So if councils were at the casino, it was actually a relatively limited proportion of their assets. And the very smallest line, which on my slide is a tiny little sort of green bar, are community and heritage assets, which are valued at 6 to 7 billion. And sales, again, quite difficult to calculate, but from the MHCLG figures, they seem to be hovering around 3 billion per annum. And somebody, IPPR, actually did a study in 2023, which felt that about 400 to 500 sales per annum are going on, which actually isn't that much when you think of the number of principal authorities we have. So next slide, please. Now, there is a lot driving us towards a stronger social value approach to asset management. I'll just pick out a couple of these things. On policy reform, the Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill will increase community ownership rights. Devolve and neighbourhood governance reforms will increase bodies which have some say over how assets are deployed. The financial realism, however, is as I think the previous slide shows, I mean, actually selling assets is just not a sustainable way to close financing gaps anyway, if that was one of the purposes. In community demand, there definitely is a demand for community asset transfers. And actually, I think there's now increasing acceptance that social infrastructure is absolutely critical to address the politics of discontent in particularly left behind communities, however we define them. Climate and net zero requirements are driving estate modernisation and estate change. And then there's a big driver in terms of public sector and community hubs, integration of services, co-location, and so on. So next slide, please, Joe. So I mean, we're never going to get to a position where finance is irrelevant to asset management, but we might at least see some local and combined authorities moving from overwhelmingly finance-driven to social and place-based asset management. I mean, there will always be multiple goals in estate acquisition, retention, and disposals, and it's really about where the balance is struck, and I think that will vary over time and institution. And then final slide, please. But it's totally feasible for mayoral strategic authorities, local authorities, and partners to develop more community-oriented criteria for property decisions. And we do see that in a number of examples. I mean, when I was researching this presentation, I certainly looked at Greater Manchester's Combined Authority Social Value Framework, which it does use in its estate management functions. Lewisham has quite a well-regarded community asset transfer support program and framework. I'm really interested, actually, in the lessons from the Scotland Community Empowerment Act, which has been in place there in 2015, and which has allowed a variety of councils to use different community-driven criteria for estate disposals. And I suppose I'll leave you actually with what I think is actually by far the largest example of an asset base which has inclusion-based purposes embedded in it, which of course is the housing revenue account, which actually, does and is required to provide affordable homes with due regard to tenant welfare, and which is used to anchor estate action and placemaking in a huge range of investment programs. So I know that Sarah's going to go into greater detail on some of these things, and she's probably in a much better place to do that than me. But last slide, please, Joe. I mean, I do hope that that has been helpful, and I look forward to the discussion after Sarah's presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks, David. Yeah, I think particularly that point on social value and the kind of the frameworks that we have already for valuing things in procurement, etc. I think I'd love to come back to that in discussion, and do, if you have any questions, put them into the Q&A box as I now hand over to Sarah Snelson from Frontier Economics.
Brilliant. Can you hear me, everybody?
Loud and clear, Sarah.
Perfect. And can you see the slides I've just shared?
Can I see the slides?
I can.
Yes. I can, yes.
Excellent. That's a good start. Brilliant. Okay, I will try and put them more into presentation mode. There we go. Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you, Joe, for inviting me to speak today, and to Localis. And great to hear from David just now. It's great to be here, great to talk about some of these issues. They are extremely pressing, as I think we're all aware. Joe's already framed this webinar about the family silver, and in some sense the sort of fiscal debate, if you like, about whether or not you're better off selling assets or not. I guess for me, and the angle that I bring to this as an economist, is through the work that we've been doing for a range of organisations thinking about the value of social infrastructure, many of which are the types of assets that we would be talking about today, and the returns that communities can get from those assets, from the shared spaces and institutions that they create. And I guess to say a little bit about the work that I've done. So I'm an economist, as Joe's already mentioned. I work for an organisation called Frontier Economics. We've done a lot of work over the last probably 5 years now with an organisation called Local Trust, who received funding from the lottery to run a programme called Big Local, which was all about investing in social infrastructure and community capacity building. We've worked with them over a number of years to develop an evidence base around the impact of that social infrastructure and some of the benefits that flow from that investment and the particular model that they were looking at, which I will share with you shortly. We've also done, as an organisation, a lot of work directly with DCMS and MHCLG. We're currently lead evaluators for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, one of the strands of which is focused on investments in community and place assets, so libraries, community centres, sports and recreation facilities, etc. So sort of bring that experience to what I'm talking about today. I guess to start off, good to think about what the question is. So I think the question we're considering is how do councils manage their assets under such extraordinary financial pressure? And as I said, this is not just a fiscal debate, but it's about, or the way I would frame it is about how we measure the returns that communities get from these shared spaces and institutions. And worth really pointing out that social infrastructure is far more than the bricks and mortar. I'm not going to attempt to describe this whole diagram on the right here, but this stems from the work we've been doing with Local Trust, where we try to define what social infrastructure means and the mechanisms through which social infrastructure can lead to beneficial economic and social outcomes for local areas. And in defining social infrastructure, it goes beyond the physical places and spaces. It's very much about how those places and spaces, coupled with community organisations and connections between communities, can actually create social capital. So we're talking there about the bonds between people in areas, which then has implications for sort of outcomes such as health, well-being, crime and civic engagement, as well as sort of more traditional effects around physical capital, creating jobs and volunteering opportunities and so on. And so what we've done as some of our work with Local Trust was to try and put some values on some of these benefits. This is difficult. I won't pretend otherwise. The evidence base is still relatively sparse in this area, in part because we're talking about reasonably small scale interventions and lots of them, and there's just not been enough work done to bring together robust evidence in that space, something that we're very actively working to fill. But using the most robust evidence out there in line with how Treasury would think about grading that evidence, we've been able to look at and quantify some of the benefits associated with scaling up and making better use of social infrastructure in areas. And so what we present here is a visual that essentially shows some of the benefits that can come. We would focus here on a fund that would look at making the best use of and scaling up the use of social infrastructure across around 70 areas in the country, with about £5 million spent per area. And what you'd see from this visual is actually there are quite significant benefits that flow from this investment. And interestingly, many of those, at least in the short term, which we were primarily focused on, are in the health and well-being space, rather than what you might typically think as being some of the benefits of this sort of infrastructure, so, you know, around employment and so on, and GVA. This work builds on kind of other kind of cutting edge evidence that's being created in this area, and thinking quite hard about how you actually put value on some of the more intangible things associated with social infrastructure, so well-being, belonging and pride in place. But it is worth noting that there are fiscal benefits that do flow from investing in social infrastructure as well. So that can reap returns in terms of health and social care savings, taxes and benefits, police and criminal justice, and so on. Obviously, there's a question about where those benefits flow to that might be worth touching on. Profile of those benefits, just to very briefly touch on that, actually, these charts sort of show indicative profiles of the time profile of some of these benefits, and show that actually you'd expect the health and well-being benefits to be the things that materialize most quickly in areas benefiting from this sort of investment, with employment benefits flowing sometime later. Trying to move my slides on, sorry. Again, another very complicated web picture here that shows the web of links from inputs on the social infrastructure side all the way through to benefits. Some of the mechanisms here, again, I'm not going to try and talk through this. This is in some of our published work, which I'm very happy to share links for further down the line. But what I wanted to point out was actually, this is not just about the physical community and social assets. You can see that in the top box here. What really matters is how those assets are used in combination with other services. Many services that actually are provided by local authorities, including sort of youth support, family support, social prescribing, and actually it's the combination and the use of those assets joining up with these services which is where the real benefits can flow from. And I guess just to finish, I wanted to think a little bit about the implications of this work. I guess what I'm trying to emphasize here is that if you only take a balance sheet approach, you miss a lot of these wider economic and social benefits, which are what make these assets really valuable. They create significant value beyond what might be considered their sale price, so particularly in terms of health, cohesion, and ultimately productivity, although we know the evidence points to that flowing further down the line. Distribution matters. We see from the evidence that unequal access to social infrastructure drives inequality between communities, and that's quite important. And investment can be catalytic. So it can be, if you put the right support in place, if you design these assets and you build in community kind of ownership and control from the beginning, they are a route to unlocking longer term growth, but that's obviously a way off in the future. The immediate benefits are kind of more on the health and well-being side from the evidence that we've seen. I guess what does that mean? Well, I think it means that we need valuation frameworks that capture both economic and social returns, not just the short-term economic, ideally. And it may be that there's a role for central government support to help councils with alternatives funding in order to kind of maintain their community assets. And most importantly, it isn't enough to just have the assets. I think it's all about what you use those assets for. It's also about building the community capacity to be able to lead and kind of really make the best of those assets. So I'll leave it there, but really looking forward to picking some of this up in discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, loads to think about there. I think, if by all means, all attending, please do feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. I certainly have a few reflections thinking off the back of those presentations. I mean, the first thing I think is one of definition, which is, what social infrastructure means and how helpful or not helpful it is to kind of have a strict definition. I think one thing that kind of got our gander off a bit of Localis here was the infrastructure strategy. The 10-year infrastructure strategy, when it came out around the time of the spending review, included a definition of social infrastructure, which we felt was very broad. And actually, they were talking about things like schools and prisons, which I would just describe as infrastructure. And I wonder, kind of, maybe starting with you, Sarah, from the work with the local trust, how sort of where you draw the line, and sort of whether it would be a good idea to have a kind of official definition, or whether it's better to kind of let that be defined in place and by purpose, I guess.
Yeah, really good question. I mean, certainly in the work that we've been doing, which has been quite extensive on this space, there are certainly individuals that would like to define social infrastructure very, very broadly, including the sorts of things that you have spoken about. The work we've done has defined it a little bit more narrowly than that. So we're really thinking about things like community centres, libraries, parks and recreation grounds, playgrounds, places and spaces that, you know, have a particular purpose of bringing people together with a focus on attempting to create sort of social capital, i.e. social connections between individuals in areas. Now, it's not to say that some of those other asset types that you mentioned don't serve that purpose in some way, but I think way we've been thinking about it is that is for these types of assets, it's more primary in terms of their focus. So that's sort of been the focus of our work. We've also, I mean, in terms of definition, does it matter? I think to some extent it does matter, in the sense of when you're thinking about the benefits that flow from different types of assets, then clearly which assets you're talking about matters. But it's not something I think it's worth getting too hung up on. I think there's a reason to believe that defining these things at the local level is quite important, so that whoever is owning these, you know, responsible for these assets, feels that the definition matters to them.
Yeah, I think I would like to get into a little bit more of that point about difference between places. David, do you have any reflections on the idea of social infrastructure defined?
Yeah, actually, it was really Sarah's last point that I was was the one I was going to make, which is that in a sense the definition is maybe important for public policy and funding and so on, but the most important thing is that local communities have a say in the, you know, both the physical, well, in the way that their place works and what they need to make the place work better. And sometimes those will be physical assets, and sometimes they will be, you know, other types of interaction. And you know, I mean, I was thinking about this whole community centre thing recently, and you know, I mean, just where I live is it's really interesting because, you know, we do have a community centre. I genuinely don't know how well patronised it is, but maybe for a particular part of the community, you know, the local, I'm sorry to use their name, but the local Facebook group is a really important communication tool which builds social capital. I suppose my main point is we have to empower communities to define how they want their places to work, and then public policy should be responsive to that.
Absolutely, and I think I want to. I'll come straight back to you, David, actually, because we've got a question from FJ Mallon. I'm sorry if I mispronounced anybody's name, by the way, but I've got a question from FJ Mallon on this thing about the link between EFS and asset sales. I know you said you've written about Woking, and I think that's a really important point. It was where, like, is it on the broadest level, exceptional financial support and the need to sell assets to get councils out of trouble. Does that work? Is that are we getting, because the BBC reporting very much kind of didn't. So yeah, please.
Well, I really want to see much more research on this, and I've been trying quite hard to to assist people to do this. My own belief is that it's a really, really bad piece of guidance. You know, it certainly did come from Lowe, and again, I'm not speaking to it personally here, but you know, it absolutely horrifies me that whatever the causes of the difficulties that places like Birmingham and Nottingham got into, that actually commissioners can be appointed by the minister with a brief which includes financially driven asset sales to close the gap, when there are very many other options for closing the financing gap. And the piece of work that I did, you know, I mean, I didn't have it on the slide because this isn't the topic of this particular webinar, but if you actually look at the financial indebtedness of councils, it is overwhelmingly, the long-term debt is overwhelmingly to the Public Works Loan Board, which is Treasury. And it's Treasury that lent this money. And if I've argued that if they made reckless lending, which is effectively what they did for certain authorities, the local taxpayer and service recipient should not have to bear the whole cost of those. And secondly, the idea that commissioners come in and basically sell off huge swathes of cities and town centres, we basically pay back the Public Works Loan Board, I think is mostly irresponsible, actually. So yeah, I'm very clear in my own mind that there has to be a much better way than financially driven asset sales to mitigate the costs of exceptional financial support for a local government structural funding crisis.
That makes perfect sense. So Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that kind of issue of EFS and social infrastructure, where they kind of intersect?
It's not something I've got a huge amount of experience of, to be honest. So I would defer to David's greater knowledge on that one.
Well, I mean, I live in Croydon, so I have a certain amount of experience on it, and I certainly think that it has a big effect, I think, on people's the commissioner model, and what that does to kind of drive asset sales has a big effect on how people view the council and where their council tax is going. And I certainly think the government should be very aware of that. It has a disenfranchising effect if you're getting an increase in your council tax bill, and at the same time we're having a whip round to try and keep a boxing club, all of that type of stuff. So Sarah, I think something probably is slightly more on your bailiwick is we've had a couple of questions on this thing about natural capital. Andrew Ross and Georgina Shredor both asked about in different ways the kind of the natural capital, nature recovery and assets. And so I think I guess I just ask a broader question. You can maybe sort of narrow on either point on kind of where natural capital plays into all of this, and where the kind where sort of nature fits in your kind of perception of social infrastructure and the work you've done with local trust.
Yeah, sure. So I guess two things. It's not been a big focus, funnily enough, on the work we've done with local trust, but we have. It's clearly one of the channels through which, local authority assets, particularly green spaces, have, clearly are important in that regard. What we haven't done is a huge exercise in sort of valuing that, valuing those using natural capital techniques. Our focus has been on essentially the other forms of value that those assets bring in terms of things like health and well-being effects, and kind of particularly like the use of sports facilities, the ability to get out in the open air, all those sorts of things. So we've used sort of complementary methods to get at some of those kind of valuation of those natural kind of capital assets. I guess to touch on something David was saying more broadly, but which is also pretty important here, is the evidence shows that it's not just about having those assets. There's several sort of complementary things that need to be in place in order that those assets are actually used in a way that does generate value beyond the sort of just the natural capital value. And that can be as simple as making sure people are aware of the assets, but it's also around like how you encourage usage. It's not enough just to have the assets available to people. It's involving the community and thinking about how those assets can be used for, particularly when you're thinking about deprived communities, in order to actually kind of generate the benefits. Like what is it that means that those communities can actually benefit more from those assets? What would make them attractive? And I think all too often we see local authorities investing in the assets without doing the complementary stuff to really make sure that those assets, once they are there, are well used and kind of generating the value that you might expect from them. So yeah, it's all about, I guess, to go back to David's point, it's all about really understanding how do communities use assets? How could they use them to generate more benefits for themselves? And, you know, really engaging with communities over that, rather than sort of, you know, I guess taking assumptions as to what communities might, you know, need from assets. With the most successful, you know, programs to build local and social infrastructure involve a heavy amount of community engagement and sort of co-creation of those things, and that's where you really see the benefits flow through in terms of you know, health and well-being or other types of benefits. I'm not sure if that actually answers the question.
No. David, did you want to come in on that natural point?
I mean, I'll just come from a slightly different level of the angle, a lens, or slightly different, which is that if we do accept that some sort of social value lens should be one of the major determinants of how you manage your assets. This is looking at it from a local or combined authority point of view. Then you have to ask, well, what are the sort of social value criteria that I would use to do that? And I mean, to in response to the question on nature recovery, I mean, and environmental value and net zero, I mean, I would have certainly expected any, you know, public body, when they're putting together their criteria of what are the values that will drive our asset management and acquisition and disposal criteria, I would certainly expect there to be environmental, you know, there would be triple bottom line. I think one of my scientists did mention triple bottom, you know, social, environmental, and economic criteria. And certainly in work that, and I think the same is probably true of assets that are managed by local communities. I mean, what the local community has to decide, together with their partners, one of whom will almost certainly be the public authority, the public sector, would be, you know, what outcomes are we trying to achieve? If some of them might well be health and well-being, some of them might well be, you know, green and decarbonisation. Who benefits from this? And this speaks to Sarah's points about, you know, do people know about this, and are they using it? Are they benefiting from the assets in our community? And then, you know, finally, what agency do local people have in the planning management of the assets? So I in my work, I quite use this sort of outcomes, benefits, involvement, agency, sort of three-tiered thing. I think, you know, in any three-tiered appraisal of a community asset, whoever owns it, you will have some environmental and nature recovery criteria.
Absolutely, it makes a lot of sense. We had a couple of questions about kind of a holistic approach. We had Pippa Casserole asked us about total place, which I'm sure we'll all be familiar with, and also we had a question in the chat about one public estate and kind of single manager. So I mean, David, you've ran local authorities in the past. Sarah, obviously, you've advised many. I wonder how, you know, the total place agenda comes and goes. It is one of those things that is far more popular generally in opposition, it has to be said, than it is in government. But yeah, we are. I would say, from an optimist how inching closer to such with long-term funding settlements, and the integrated settlement for the MSA is sort of getting towards the idea of total place. So I wonder, I guess I'll start with you, David, as someone with chief executive experience, of how important a total place approach is to realising the type of shift in perspective you're talking about.
I think total place is absolutely critical. I think that, you know, there are actually lots of sort of mini total place examples of service integration, co-location, the sort of casework issues around troubled families. You know, there's lots of examples of sort of parts of a total place agenda seeming to achieve better results than siloed approaches. And I do think social infrastructure can be a really powerful anchor for a lot of total place-esque type approaches to problem solving or community development or regeneration, without necessarily there having to be a fully blown sort of total place 2.0. Having said that, I would really like to see some at scale place-based budgeting, probably at neighbourhood, local authority and even combined authority level over the coming period. And I think that that's even more critical in a period where resources are really tight, because siloed resourcing will always have built-in duplication. And much as I hate to do this on your webinar, Joe, I have literally just finished recording an episode of the podcast that I co-host, LED Confidential, which will be out either at the end of the month or early October, actually, which is explicitly on a total place 2.0 discussion with a prominent national figure in that debate. So
no, absolutely no problem.
Interested, come back to me.
Yeah, absolutely no problem with that. LED Confidential, check it out wherever you get your podcast. Sarah, do you have any sort of thoughts on total place and how that plays into all of this? And indeed, total estate, sort of one public estate management as well, you know.
So to me, I mean, I agree with a lot of what David's just said. I think taking a place-based lens to this policy, this sort of area, is absolutely critical. What a lot of the evidence suggests is that the biggest gain, the biggest benefits are felt from the use of kind of assets in a local area where where those assets are combined with other services. There's a joined up approach to thinking about what you're trying to achieve in different in a given area. We see strong evidence, for example, if you can join up the provision of things like community support signposting to different services in a local area, or even co-location of those services, that can reap strong benefits, particularly in deprived communities. So and knowing what you're attempting to achieve with different types of assets for different types of people and joining that up across the area makes complete sense. I think the other thing I would add is our work has also showed the importance, depending on the state, the types of communities that a local authority is supporting, there's also huge benefit for joining up the thinking about what is the focus within a given community with the wider area. So, particularly when you start to get into questions about local economic growth, you cannot do that in isolation of knowing what is going on in areas close by to you, and how you join any given community to wider centres of economic activity becomes really, really critical. So if part of the focus of having sort of community assets becomes about creating employment opportunities in order to, support people into the workplace, for example, then you need to ensure then that that's joined up with there being access to centres of employment and so on. So it goes beyond the local place. And I think when we're talking place here, I would also think that going very local neighbourhood level makes a lot of sense, and then sort of building up from there. And neighbourhoods themselves, we talked about definition earlier. Actually, neighbourhoods self-define in many different, and communities self-define in many different ways, and actually being really conscious of that when developing policy, at a place level is critical, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with this piece in the English devolution bill about neighbourhood governance units and what they might look like, I think that's a bit of a can of worms, you say there, as neighbourhoods self-defined, it's not always kind of clean. There's a couple of great questions in the chat from Martin Saunders. I want to kind of try and particularly look at his point that he makes in the Q&A about time horizon, because I think one of the things we talk about when we talk about social infrastructure a lot is prevention, and it's kind of the savings it can make for the council along the way, whether it's kind of in a strictly operational sense or in reducing service pressures. And I wonder, again, to come back to you, Sarah, on this, when you do the work you've done with local trust on savings for things like health services or just not using services, how you make a case for that, given the longer time horizon and the kind of the fiscal cycle often that people will be looking at when they're doing the asset valuation.
Yeah, I mean it's not easy. I'll start with that, because obviously we are talking in some cases about longer time horizons, particularly when you're thinking about, you know, longer term health benefits and so on. But actually, there are some more immediate things. So we've seen, I mean, just to pick an example, we've seen some great examples where very simple interventions, for example, having a small community hub that you know, is put in place near to a doctor's surgery, and actually, you know, can divert kind of people from GP appointments, because actually, you know, in some communities, the primary driver of a lot of those appointments is loneliness, and actually providing an alternative can be quite powerful. So there are some really great, you know, very simple examples where you know, the use of community assets in a very targeted way can actually support the, you know, I guess savings and efficiencies within the health service at large, either because it defers a kind of appointments, or kind of supports people not reaching crisis point, you know. And there's a lot of work going on in the health space right now, around neighbourhood health care teams and so on, trying to join all these things up in order that you get not only the shorter term benefits in terms of reducing pressure on other services in your area, but also then reap the longer term benefits in terms of, you know, things like employment in the area and so on. So it's not all long term, but it's, you know, need careful thinking as to how to generate the sort of shorter term benefits to communities. And there are other things, you know, around sort of feelings and perceptions of safety in an area that can be quite short term. Obviously, they don't necessarily generate fiscal benefits straight away, but there's sort of layers of benefits that you can get to and different time horizons. But I think the biggest sort of focus that we've had in terms of developing some of these cases for Treasury is around this sort of short-term divergence, if you like, away from what are very high cost kind of health services. Health and mental health services can be quite powerful.
So, David, do you have any sort of thoughts on that issue of kind of time horizons?
I sort of agree totally with Sarah. We've just got to find a balance. The sustaining social capital and well-being in, you know, particularly left behind places and transforming them into successful ones is a generational job, or a generational set of tasks. But I totally agree with Sarah that you've got to start somewhere, and you can actually do some quite simple, quite low cost things very quickly. And I think, you know, I suppose what worries me is, in a way, you don't want to have to be making a national case for Treasury every time you're doing this, or even to have a national policy for it. What you want is empowered, combined local and neighbourhood entities that actually have the resource to do the quick wins pretty quickly. And then, in a sense, government needs to set the generational framework. You know, ideally, I would have to say, you know, given the state of politics at the moment, you know, with some level of multi-party support so that it will endure past a single political cycle, to make the generational journey.
Yeah, absolutely, David. And I think, you know, this is not something that it's hard to establish cross-party support on the hyper-local level, actually. I think that's probably where it's easiest to get it. Sarah, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to add something, because I forgot to say it earlier, but I think, because I completely agree, you don't want to be making a sort of national case all the time for these things. Actually, one of the sort of strongest areas of evidence that we've seen is around the concept of social prescribing, which links very kind of directly, I guess, to some of the interventions that can be made at local level. So I assume people are familiar with the concept, but basically involves doctors, rather than prescribing treatments, prescribing kind of activities. If there is then the availability of those activities as a result of having community infrastructure, joining those things up can be really quite powerful, and unlocks quite a lot of, can, in principle, obviously it's all in the practice, but can in principle unlock quite a lot of benefits. So again, it's on this sort of joining up with the health, the kind of health side of things, because there's quite a lot of action in that space at the moment. Sorry, I just wanted to add that point.
No, it's a very good point, and I think social prescribing is a really good example of something that I think at hyperlocal level almost always has support when you explain what it is and kind of how it works. I think you can find support for that, but as you say, if you don't have sports clubs, etc., to go to, then it doesn't work. In answer to a question, but yes, this will be recorded. It will be on YouTube, and we will send it.
Can I?
Go on, David.
Can I just? I actually like to ask Sarah a question. I mean, I'm sort of, if you don't mind, because. And it might be useful for the other participants. I am aware of the sort of big local work that you've obviously been working with. I mean, has that come up with an accessible menu, if you like, of, you mentioned social prescribing, a sort of a menu of options that would be very accessible for communities and neighbourhoods that they could sort of discuss amongst themselves as to where the gaps are in their neighbourhood, and then discuss with other partners how they might fill the gaps. Is there a sort of a menu that we can look at? Or should we do one?
I don't think so. Our work has definitely not gone that far. What we have, so we've contributed obviously to the broader work that Local Trust is doing. They are, at the moment, I understand, moving, the big local funding will cease fairly shortly, and so they're in their legacy stage. They are in the process of creating a big repository of information that brings together all the insights from their work over the many years in which they've been making these kind of supporting communities. I don't think it goes as far in our work as to say here's a menu of options, in part because I guess one of the biggest things that comes out of the work is the need for the community to kind of lead the way, if you like. But the critical bit, I think, that does come out is this focus around capacity building, which is often very overlooked in communities, i.e., it's not possible for all communities, particularly the most deprived ones, to actually engage with the question of what is needed in their local area unless you go through a process of supporting them in building capacity. And then once they've got that capacity, then you can start talking about, well, these are the sets of things that are could be sensible ideas, but often the best ideas are generated from within the communities themselves. And so I think there's certainly an evidence base about the types of things that have worked better or less well, but a lot of it is so context specific. It's important to bear that in mind. But I think that is one of the bits when pulling together their evidence base, and I'm happy to sort of point people to where I think this repository is going to be. That will be, if you like, a useful source. I don't think it will go as far as a menu of options, though, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess that tension, that's always part of the issue of trying to do this hyperlocal stuff. And I think the other thing as well to note on big local is the time frame and how patient it all was. You're looking at a 10-year giving out of capital, which is just not the way that central government have run this type of stuff in the past sort of decade or so, whereas they would get money out quickly, sort of, and you can understand the political imperatives for that. But I think one thing what we sort of touched on with Local Trust I've always been impressed with just how important the time frame is to all this, and how important patience is to all of this, which again is not necessarily conducive to our current political cycles. But anyway, we're on the last 5 minutes, so I'm going to wrap things up. I guess I just wanted one final sort of question to ask both of you, because I think it's an interesting point, especially in the light of the local government outcomes framework currently being out of conversation. As Paul Dislington asked about market value and sort of valuation data, and that kind of made me think about, well, there's also the other thing of how up to date and accurate is our data on the kind of the social value and the kind of the other side of it all. So I suppose I guess if you had any thoughts on kind of Sarah or Dave from your own work about kind of metrics that could be used and ways that we could try to kind of value these things in a way that isn't strictly financial, but is still kind of useful and is still data.
Yeah. So there are a number of data sets that are emerging now. Obviously, this is hugely caveated by the fact that getting really good, very local neighborhood level data is still a massive challenge. But in terms of putting that, if you know what you have in your area and you know how it's used, in terms of starting to put value on those things, there are some useful, I can happily share some links afterwards, but there are some useful kind of calculators that are starting to be developed. So for example, how do you value the sense of pride that is created in people in order to like as a result of having these assets in their area or seeing investment in their area? There are now values that you can use for that. I'm sure people will be aware, but there's been quite a lot of work over recent years in terms of valuing sort of health and well-being benefits, particularly more now on the well-being side. We've actually done quite a bit of work ourselves thinking about how you translate that into value from things like cultural and heritage assets for DCMS. So there are now kind of example kind of values that you can use for looking at some of these types of areas. The other thing I guess to say on that is, I mean, obviously there are things like kind of natural capital valuations. There's a lot of calculators out there where you can start kind of translating the things that you are investing in, if you like, into kind of these wider social benefits. I guess one final thought on that is that obviously I know it's not just, a lot of these things are not monetizable in the sense of you can put a value on them, but you can't immediately reap the returns. So some of these calculators also attempt to then translate that into what it means for fiscal benefits. And, you know, then there's obviously a question of to who those benefits flow to, but that can also be quite useful kind of tools for local authorities.
Brilliant, thanks. David, any thoughts on that question of metrics before we go?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all that. There's lots of calculators, there's lots of indices, and I think what local neighbourhoods and groups and local authorities need to do is sort of, in a sense, iterate those types of tools against their vision and values for their community. So you might get quite bespoke local valuation frameworks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks so much. So I will draw us to a close with 2 minutes to spare. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along and watching the webinar. And thank you so much to our speakers, Sarah Snelson and David Marlow. That was really, really helpful. And we'll make sure to get in touch with any links that need sharing to the audience and also to the YouTube link once it's up there. Thanks very much for coming to the webinar. We will be back next month talking about procurement. So thank you, everybody, and do keep an eye out. Sign up to our newsletter for further webinars. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.
Okay. You want to